Hi there, I'm Claudio Popa from Knowledge Flow Cyber Safety Foundation, and I've got David Krebs from Miller Thompson. He is a cyber lawyer. David, welcome.
Thanks, Claudio.
When I describe you as a cyber lawyer, that's a gross description. How would you describe yourself?
I like the sound of cyber lawyer. I'm not. I think probably technology and privacy lawyer is a good one.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And you are located. I'm in Toronto, and you are in Saskatchewan.
I'm located in beautiful, sunny, and chilly Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. That is correct.
Is awesome. That's one of my favorite cities to visit. I invited David to join me today because he posted a few weeks ago. He posted on LinkedIn something that caught my eye, and it basically amounted to a piece of news that said that no longer are victims of ransomware just having to worry about the ransom amount and the fact that their business activities have come to a halt and the fact that their data is being held hostage by cyber criminals and the fact that there's a reputational impact and so on and so forth. David posted something that was a piece of news that had an interesting effect. And that effect, as far as I can tell, was for it to be completely ignored by the media. The news was that ransomware victims could not just willy-nilly start negotiating with cyber extortionists. The news came from the US, and it was from an office called the OFAC. I'm hoping you can tell us what that means, David. But essentially what it says is that we are not free to just make ransom payments, that we now have to worry about who those payments are going to. And that adds a layer of complexity that, quite frankly, I'm not even sure where to start with it. So could you tell us whether this is a piece of legislation and how that came about?
So, Claudia, the U.S. is known for creating rules and laws that can have a pretty long arm and can reach across its borders to making sure that certain requirements and certain things that the United States government wants to protect are protected. And in this case, what OFAC wants to achieve is to make sure that terrorists, certain groups that are on terror watch lists or just the OFAC lists, are not receiving funds through something like a ransomware payment. Now these lists have existed for a longer time, and they're there to make sure that funds that American businesses and subsidiaries of American businesses and businesses that have a connection to the United States aren't inadvertently or purposefully funding terrorists. So ransomware payments, it's interesting because when organizations are faced with that, as you mentioned, tough decisions sometimes, whether or not to pay to get their files back in an attack, oftentimes the identity of those individuals or those groups aren't necessarily known, right? Whereas in other cases, you might have situations where that entity, that individual, and an organization might check that name against a watch list. So before making payment, or you see this sort of in the export control area as well, before you ship a certain product to either a certain country or an individual, you might have some sort of an automatic screen that makes sure that your product doesn't get into the hands of a sanctioned individual. on the basis of their person or where they're located. So what these rules are basically saying, and again, I'm not an American lawyer, but what these rules are saying is that you could be held, responsible for, and it's more of an alert. It's sort of an awareness for people to know that, well, just because it's a ransom payment in a ransomware situation doesn't mean that these rules don't apply.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to be, aware. You have to be cautious.
So would those be civil penalties or criminal penalties applied to ostensibly U.S. companies
Well,
transferring funds to terror groups? I guess that's how they would.
correct. Yeah, and I mean, I guess you'd have to, how this would play out. And again, I'm not aware right now of a case where this is sort of a live issue at this point. But as you said, this alert came out not too long ago. But it's not just when you say American businesses. I think we have to be a little bit careful there, because it could very well affect organizations that have a tie to the United States. So it doesn't have to be just an American business that's located in America. It could very well be, a Canadian business with subsidiaries in the US.
Or vice versa, ostensibly?
Vice versa. I mean, it could get pretty, again, fact specific, but it's definitely possible. It's not to sort of say that it's just a problem for American businesses. That's not true. And especially for multinationals, I mean, this is a consideration.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so I just did a quick Google search, and it says here that, so on October 1st, 2020, the U.S. Treasury has an office, the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control,
Yep.
and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network warned that facilitators, namely, in our view, these are victims of ransomware, but they would be considered facilitators of payments to cyber criminals, could be prosecuted even if the victims did not know that the hackers demanding the ransom were subject to U.S. sanctions. So perhaps I jumped the gun there. In that case, facilitators could be the insurance company, or it could be the experts, the negotiators appointed by the insurance companies. It doesn't necessarily have to be the ransomware victim. Is that right?
I mean, it's a broader swath than that. And I think where we have to be careful, you can't, I mean, normally with rules and regulations like this, you would want, you would caution organizations to have, processes in place in order to prevent things like this, right? So mistakes can happen, sometimes, shipments are made, payments are made, but in terms of liability, if you have a process or a system in place to prevent, money going to bad actors, to sanctioned individuals, that will go a long way into sort of reducing your liability, generally speaking. Now, in this case, the trick is, how does one do that in a ransomware situation? I mean, that's a you don't know the individuals.
Well, that's precisely it. Is ignorance an excuse? If you didn't know what you were speeding, you're still gonna get a speeding ticket. So,
Yeah.
how can even insurance companies now have to have a new process in place for doing their due diligence and saying, okay, I realize we've got 24 hours to make this payment, otherwise it's going to triple, but let us do our due diligence into who's asking for the money. Is it a terror group? Do we know anything about these guys? Is it just a guy in a basement, in which case go ahead and pay him off because he may not be a terrorist? How does that change the policies and procedures for organizations that have been in this business, either as negotiators or technical facilitators. There's any number of companies that now are working with insurance companies, as you well know, because that's the kind of work that you do in advising victims and other parties. But there's all sorts of technical companies that are sitting there ready to negotiate, and then they've got Bitcoin accounts that are ready to pay whatever negotiated fee is obviously the culmination of that unpleasant discussion. So does that impact those companies, and do they have to bring in a whole set of procedures for checking, let's say, a terror list or some sort of indicators that that the party asking for these things is on some kind of a terror list?
I mean, that's interesting questions, Claudio, because
I'm asking the tough questions for our audience.
yeah.
And obviously your authoritative answers are going to be the final say in this.
I know, absolutely.
Everyone's going to make decisions based on what you say right now.
Right now, yeah. OFAC is listening. I think to a certain extent we have to wait how this is meant to be implemented. Right now, what I would say is, if I had a client and you become aware that, name your group, Maze, whatever, has just newly been placed on the OFAC watch list. I would think that the decision to make that payment should be made weighing your liability under these rules, which means you probably shouldn't make that payment.
So, to me, it's fascinating that it strikes me as the entire subculture of cyber extortion is based on fear of losing something, and therefore, so many people are terrified of it that you could just basically say, look, as long as you can identify any particular group, you add them. As soon as you can identify them, you add them to a terror list. So what's stopping the OFAC or the US Treasury from adding every single cyber crime group to a terror list? And suddenly insurance companies can no longer legally make or facilitate payments to these would-be terror groups. Is that something that's likely to happen, or am I talking about some kind of a fantasy scenario?
Well, Claudia, you never talk fantasy.
Oh no, I'm a science fiction guy. I'm more of a Star Trek than Star Wars guy. I see the baby Yoda behind you there, so this is a qualified answer.
That's right. I think the again, going back to the anonymity of some of these groups is potentially an issue, right? Because these watch lists are based on known individuals, right? So payments to individuals, they're not based on payments to concepts or groups.
Precisely. So as soon as you identify them, it becomes illegal to pay them.
If you could identify, yeah. If you could identify, John Smith is a part of, yes, absolutely. You could do that.
Right. That's interesting. Because that could change. Some of the largest groups that we've seen, and I don't want to name any because they're going to get a big head, in the past year, that have been raking in tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, are now recognizable, not just by their behavior, but because they identify themselves. And so does that mean that they're being added to a terror list, and it's going to be very difficult for organizations to pay them, even if they are held for ransom? And perhaps more importantly, how does that affect Canadian businesses?
It's I should have probably done my homework before this, but I'm
Gotcha.
I would think it's still difficult
Yeah.
to make an organization liable for, making payments as you described, where you have a group of individuals that's, do we really know enough about the group to be able to put a fence around it? And if you had a known individual, right, that would I'm sure change the game. To have a group that has a name, that's more difficult.
So going forward, is it in the interest of these cyber criminals to remain anonymous, so that by not informing the victim about who they are, as scary as they might want to make themselves out to be, they just say, look, I'm not going to even introduce myself. We don't have to have any kind of relationship. You just pay the money. No one needs to know who you're paying it to. And you are, in fact, protected from new laws, new rules like this one that are designed to keep you, the victim, from paying us and recovering control over your data and your business. Is that what we're going to see? We're going to see less of less pride, because a lot of these groups are very proud of having systematized the process of extorting people. Are we going to see more of a tendency to remain anonymous, just to speed up the process and perhaps to avoid being identified?
I don't know, Claudio.
So if you were a cyber extortionist, and I don't know what side job you might have, but if you were, would you prefer to remain anonymous under these conditions?
I don't know. I would probably wait to see, the benefit.
You would read the newspaper, see how it goes.
To see how it goes, I would probably weigh my brand against,
Yeah, that's right.
If I wasn't getting paid as I would have expected, then I might think, geez, darn OFAC.
That's right. You'd have to register a DBA, doing business as, maybe spin off some trade names. Just as soon as you get one brand gets tarnished and added to a list, you spawn another.
Yeah, because I think taking these groups and comparing them to, okay, known sort of, let's say a business, right, that has a corporate office, that has shareholders, that has directors, it's a little bit different, right? Because if an individual, a known individual, is on one of these lists, they start a business with another person, that person might get dragged into that issue. Now, you as an organization making a payment to, let's say, even outside of the ransomware situation, doing business with an individual like that, if you don't have the processes in place, you might not know of a known association with the problem individual. So I think in this case, it's a little tricky, because we're not dealing with, organizations that have shareholders, and it's a bit looser than that, right?
It certainly is, and it's still early days. I mean, this is October that it was announced. This betrays my feeble understanding of government structures, but in Canada, what would be the equivalent of the U.S. Treasury's OFAC office? Like, would there have to be some sort of equivalent endorsement for this type of rule for this to be much more significant to Canadian businesses? Or is it just sufficient that the U.S. Treasury has announced this and suddenly we now have to worry about it in Canada?
Well, you have to worry about it for different reasons. I mean, so if the the Canadian equivalent, of course, the impact would be much more significant in Canada if we had a rule in Canada, spelling out Right.
think, thank you.
I mean,
Thank you for
but
stating the obvious,
well,
and lowering yourself to the level of
no,
question that I asked, because I tried to ask really, I guess because I think in basic terms. I was just thinking that perhaps not all Canadian companies go through insurance when they pay ransoms. Does would
not at all. Yeah.
would that expose them to more liability if, in fact, even if there wasn't enforcement in Canada, just if there was enforcement through the current climate, through the US, would they be exposed to more liability as a result of not going through the insurance process and not having the insurance company's legal advisors and breach coaches such as yourself, who would walk them in a professional manner through a bit of a standardized process and seeking proper resolution?
I mean, if you're a Canadian organization that has, potentially enough ties to the US,
Then you're impacted.
well, then I mean, Claudia, it's definitely, it's a consideration. If I was an organization, I would think back, I would look at this and I'd want to know more about it.
Right.
Because, and you've asked a lot of good questions, and I'm not sure if I've really given a lot of good answers, but I don't, it's one of those things where if I was an organization, Canadian organization with potential ties to the US, I would look into this a bit, and to see if this is something that would would have an impact on my, on the risk.
And where would you start looking? Would you call let's say a breach coach, a lawyer, perhaps with Miller Thompson, or would you do Google research? How Google research? Where would you start researching these things?
I mean, Claudia, I'll throw it back to you here. I mean, if you're in the risk management business, and this heightens the risk, is what it does, right? If you think you're not at risk of ever being subject to a cyber attack and having to pay ransom, this doesn't change things for you. If you think there's a chance that you will at some point be confronted with a ransom payment, which not everybody might know that they might be, but if you are, then I think these guidelines heighten the risk to a certain extent.
I agree. And I think from my perspective,
not for everyone. For most people, it might do nothing, and for some, it might really, because
right.
Yes, if you make a payment and you're unlucky enough that for some reason the stars align and you've just paid off a terrorist, and at the same time, OFAC is concerned with that. You don't want to be in that situation. I think that's the message. You don't want to be caught. Now, what is the real impact for many Canadian organizations? Well, for many, it's not going to matter because they don't have enough ties to the US. For some that do have ties to the US, I would think it's something that you need to at least consider before, it should form part of that. And, you should probably monitor how this develops over the next, over 2021.
Are specific sectors in Canada, do you think, should they be more careful? Does this impact, let's say, the financial industry? Does it impact healthcare? Does it impact education? What sectors do you think should pay more attention to this in Canada?
Probably the private business sector. Potential, healthcare, it's sort of, I would start off, okay, where's my risk to being subject to cyber attacks? Now, the industries that you mentioned, or the sectors that you mentioned, they're all, they're interesting targets, right, for cyber attackers, as we've seen. Now, whether or not, to what extent they're going to be having sufficient connection to the US, I don't know. I think that's where private business is probably, most susceptible.
I guess a number of my clients are in the financial space, and they may or may not have dealings directly to the US, but one thing that we do notice about the FI space is that it certainly has no shortage of regulations applied to their operations and the way they handle information and cybersecurity and accountability and so on. And I guess one of the things that I would instinctively do, in particular, as it pertains to the fact that our own privacy commissioners have now started talking about breach preparedness and incident management and all this good, solid planning, with the goal of minimizing the response time, right? If there's an event or an incident, you want to minimize the response time, you want to minimize the discovery of the situation, et cetera. So from my perspective, as I'm helping clients and I advise organizations in Canada, one of the things that I would think makes sense is to take a look at their incident response playbooks and take a look at that order of operations and say, okay, well, maybe between discovery and payment, we need to pay some additional attention to who it is that we're paying. Would you recommend that as a breach coach? Would you recommend that people review their playbooks?
I would recommend that. Absolutely. I think it's something, it's a consideration. Now, I think where we're struggling a little bit, where I would struggle right now, is to know exactly how OFAC intends for this to be implemented. I think that's something where we would struggle a little bit, but I think it's definitely a consideration. It is a consideration, and I think they've highlighted, right? Because before this came out, and I'm not sure who's aware and who isn't, but people may have never thought about this, and I know that I do get questions now and again from clients where they ask me, before they're making a payment, is it legal to make a ransom payment?
Right.
Is it legal? And to the surprise of many, is not just in a ransomware situation, but in your traditional kidnapping scenario, paying a ransom isn't necessarily illegal. That being said, this particular issue is an issue that if you are knowingly or not, if you are paying a terrorist, that's an issue, and that money is then being used to fund terrorist activity, and that is also something in Canada that is an issue. So I think that that's a consideration that especially if I'm a larger organization with or a smaller organization where this would have a big impact, I think it's something to consider.
Excellent. So one final question. I think part of the due diligence that potentially a victim would do would be around, I guess, the limited capacity to figure out who it is that they're paying. However, insurance companies are organizations that are seeing this happening every single day. Like they are seeing, perhaps they're keeping track of patterns, perhaps they're keeping track of the similarities between ransom notes, perhaps they're keeping track of the recording the entire negotiation. Either way, they have ostensibly a bigger picture view of this as a trend, and perhaps they are better suited to identifying the recipients of those funds. Would that make insurance companies, I guess, perfectly suited to, at least in the near term, worry more about this type of of new rule, or I don't want to call it a law. I'm not sure that it is a law. It's a rule, is it?
I mean, when you use the word perfectly, I think they're going to have a lot more data,
Yes.
right? And
more visibility, right? Like they can see across, not just across entire sectors, but they would see across borders as well, because some of these, I mean, Lloyd's of London, for example, right? They've clearly got a ton of data on the processes that lead to them paying out various amounts in cyber extortion scenarios.
And maybe the question is, and it'd be interesting to sort of share notes with our American colleagues to see what they've seen.
Mm-hmm.
But a fair question, probably, if you're engaging your insurance company and your breach coach and your cyber response team, is to ask that question. To say, I think I need to make a payment here. It would make life easier on my organization for us to get back up and running. Am I running the risk of paying off a terrorist here and then having the US government come after me?
Right.
I think that's a fair question to ask.
Well, it'll certainly be interesting to watch the story develop.
Yeah.
Again, it's new still. By all estimates, we're going to see an even greater increase in ransomware in the new year, simply because that seems to be the new business model. It seems to tie very well in with social engineering and all those business email compromises that we're seeing all over the place. So unfortunately, we're looking, towards an inevitable increase in this type of criminal activity. So it remains to be seen how this develops in the new year and perhaps beyond.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I want to thank you for your time and expertise. This has been very enlightening. I haven't been able to find any coverage of this. I mean, there's a couple of articles on it, and I consider our discussion to be one of the first and perhaps the most meaningful discourses on this topic. I'm hoping there will be more. I hope people enjoyed it, and hopefully it'll spark new questions beyond just the ones that I've peppered you with. So thank you very much for allowing yourself to be a victim today, and looking forward to our next interview.
Thanks, Claudio.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.